From CBS 47 and Fox 30, it's time for This Week in the 904.
Welcome to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Emily Turner. This is a community affairs show, and we focus on politics, public policy, and all of these issues that affect our local communities here. And joining us today, we have Dr. David Jaffee with UNF and his student research assistant, Katie Renzi. And you guys have been doing some really exciting and interesting work. Why don't you talk a little bit about what that is and where it started?
Sure. So we started the Jax Rental Housing Project in 2022. The main reason we started this project was because at that time, Jacksonville in 2021, there were lots of media reports that rent rates were going up dramatically, spiking across the country, but particularly in Sunbelt cities. And we were seeing that in Jacksonville. So I decided as a sociologist who does community-based work to investigate this in more detail. So we launched the project in 2022. And we were, essentially trying to investigate what some of the factors were that contributed to the rising rent rates in Jacksonville. And, we checked lots of other research that had been done in other places. Some of the best has been done in Atlanta. And we began to develop a kind of model about what the factors are, the kind of data we needed to collect. Now, I call this a community-based public sociology project, so obviously it's community-based. We're focusing on material conditions of life of working people in Jacksonville. It's public sociology in the sense that we do sociological investigation, analysis, and writing, but we are not devoting that to a journal article that's read by a small number of people. We make all of the work we do public. We publish reports, which we disseminate widely to city council members, as well as to other people in the community who have some relationship to housing and housing issues. So we're focusing on rental housing and the experience that people are having in Jacksonville, paying higher and higher rents, and what factors are responsible. Now, as a University of North Florida faculty member in the Department of Sociology, I also wanted to involve students in this project. And so right from the start, I probably had about 8 or 9 students that volunteered to get involved. One of these was Katie Renzi, who's here. She was involved from the very beginning, has been involved since, and is the project manager.
And Katie, from your experience, you've clearly been involved, you managed the whole thing. What are some of the things that you guys found when you did this study?
Yeah, so the largest thing that immediately, I started working on back in summer of 2022 was trying to identify who owns these properties, because something that's really insidious about the way that ownership works and the records that are publicly available is that typically when you look up an apartment complex, I was specifically looking at complexes with 10 or more units, they tend to be owned by an LLC, and that LLC usually doesn't indicate who the actual owner is. So through painstaking hours, I identified the ownership for over 600 apartment complexes in Jacksonville, and that is a publicly available resource on the Jax Rental Housing Project website. But really identifying who those owners are and being able to connect them and say, well, actually this owner, with seemingly unrelated LLCs, they actually own 6 of the same apartment complexes, and there are, high evictions of the complex, high building code violations across the complexes. Being able to identify that this is actually a trend is really useful.
I jokingly call this SunBiz bingo, because you take the property appraisers. I had to do this for a story I worked on with a commercial landowner, where it's like this LLC goes back to this address according to SunBiz, and all the other addresses that go back to this. It's a real time suck. And so, kudos to you for doing that work. When it comes to commercial real estate, or commercial landlords rather,
yeah.
Why should someone care about the difference between a mom and pop, me renting my condo out versus, some big corporate landlord?
Well, the theme of the Jax Rental Housing Project is the financialization of human shelter. That's basically the core concept that we focus on. What do we mean by that? Well, we use the term human shelter because we want people to understand that everybody requires shelter. It's a basic human need. And in the United States, it's basically commodified. It's privately owned, it's for profit. That's already a problem. The problem is exacerbated further when you have the financialization of human shelter, where the properties are essentially being bought up by large corporate entities and converted into, investment instruments for wealthy clients. So what's happening in Jacksonville, for example, and many other communities, but Jacksonville is probably one of the most significant when it comes to this, financialization of human shelter, corporate landlord invasion, whatever you want to call it, is you have corporate entities coming in, they're buying up hundreds and thousands of single family homes, they're converting these homes into rental properties, they're bundling the rental properties into a portfolio, and they're offering these to their wealthy clients. And the same thing is happening in the multifamily apartment complex that Katie was studying, right? So we're doing this single family, multifamily. It's happening in both areas. Financialization. What is the business model? The business model is to acquire the properties, is to offer them as investment opportunities for their wealthy clients. They promise typically something between often 8 to 12% return. In order to do that, one of the first things they do is they increase rents, they add fees, and they neglect maintenance. The net result is, on the one hand, you have investors who are receiving passive income from investing in these portfolios. On the other hand, you've got working class people in Jacksonville struggling to make ends meet, seeing their rent go up steadily. And since 2020, just to give you the statistic, we see basically, depending on which real estate company is measuring this, we've seen probably a 30 to 40% increase in monthly rent, roughly between $300 and $500. That's over a 3, 4, 5-year period.
So rent in Jacksonville has just skyrocketed.
It's skyrocketing, and when this began in 2021, and we started this project in 2022 as a response to that, Jacksonville was consistently listed as the top 5, top 10 metro areas that were seeing the sharpest rise in rent. And today what we have is we are number 2 when it comes to the percent of single family rentals that are owned by what are called mega investors. This was a General Accounting Office report that just came out. So the phenomena, which is nationwide, is more pronounced in the Sun Belt, and within the Sun Belt, it's even more pronounced in Jacksonville. So that is what we're studying, that is what we're documenting, and we're trying to raise awareness about this. And ideally, we would hope that there would be some policies put in place to the extent that they're allowable in Florida or possible in Florida.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that report, and you and I have had long conversations about it. Coming back just after this break, we'll get more into those numbers and why those numbers matter in our communities. We'll be right back.
From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
Welcome back to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Emily Turner. We are talking today all about the Jax Rental Housing Project. And Katie, as the project manager, you've seen these numbers and in the nitty-gritty, done the math. When it comes to Jacksonville specifically, what are the numbers so that you can really paint a clear picture for people who may have no idea this is happening?
Yeah, right. Well, and first of all, before I talk about numbers, a lot of different reports have been done on this topic. And again, something that we were talking about before, LLCs, it's very difficult to identify who really owns that LLC. It could be a smaller scale investor, or it could be a mega corporation that, again, is using all of these different LLCs. Trying to connect them is difficult. So for this project, we used mailing addresses to try to loop those back to the actual owner. And with that methodology that we used, we found about 5% of all single family homes are owned by investment firms. So, think Invitation Homes, Tricon Residential, some people, that may be their landlord. The problem is another 5% are owned by other LLCs. So those are ones that we didn't directly loop back to a company, but that doesn't mean that those aren't also owned by maybe a smaller firm. But those, that 5%, they own 50 or more single family homes in Jacksonville, each one of those firms. Some of them own thousands. So it truly is, a wide scope issue. And also something that we noticed is that a lot of these firms, for more recent purchases, they try to concentrate in subdivisions because that makes managing them a lot easier. So that is also an aspect of it.
Well, and when it comes to location, you guys there's certain zip codes where this is more prevalent.
Yes.
What are those, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, so 32218 on the north side, and then some of the far west zip codes, those are the highest institutional investor concentrations in Jacksonville. And really the reason for that is because those areas tend to have newer subdivisions. So the newer strategy, post-COVID was to invest in newer subdivisions that were built. Oftentimes they will bulk purchase directly from developers. So as soon as these homes are built, they're immediately getting shifted into the single-family rental market. And so that is what's really driving, these further exurban zip codes to have a higher rate of ownership.
Is there a particular price point we're talking about? Because I don't imagine they're not like real big fancy mansions, that they're probably targeting a certain demographic here.
Right, yes. So with the investment, they tend to target medium value homes. So that's why you see it in 32218, but you see it lesser so in 32258, for example, so the Bartram area. And that's because from what we've researched, it seems to be there's more resistance in those higher value neighborhoods, both by local residents, which tend to have higher income NIMBYs that are living there, not in my backyard.
Right.
And so because of that reason, that creates a little bit of pressure, but also just those higher values on those properties makes it a less sure investment for these investment firms who tend to prefer lower value that then they can guarantee more of a return on the rental.
Interesting. And so when it comes to this, because affordable housing, I think, can be a political topic, right? Some people want to label this as like, far left and progressive and think about rent control and whatever, or, but in this situation, specifically in Jacksonville, and the other argument too would be, oh, well, this free market, right? It's supply and demand, it's economics.
Yeah.
But there's a real critical, apolitical reason that this impacts our society. What is that?
Well, first of all, this impacts all working class people. It's not something that's narrowly focused on, the destitute, the lowest income. Now, we've looked at this. When we look at affordable housing, and everyone says, they pay lip service to affordable housing, but the question is, well, what is the policy you're proposing? But when we measure affordable housing, what we're often talking about is, or the single most popular measure, most widely used measure, is the cost burden. So what percent of renters are spending 30% of their income or more on rent, right? So in Jacksonville, it's 59%. It's gone up probably since 2019. The largest increase in the percent of renters that are cost burdened. We are number 2 among metro areas. So again, this is a huge problem. So they're cost burdened, which means they're paying 30% or more of their income on rent, which leaves much less income available for the other necessities. We often use the phrase, the rent eats first. You have to have a roof over your head. That's where the money goes. Regardless of whether it's going up, you can't just easily look for another housing option. You can't simply easily move, etc. So that's where the idea of the market, that somehow people can just easily choose and decide where they're going to go. They can reject one housing situation if it's too expensive and move to another. The housing market does not work that way. We also have 30% who are severely cost burdened. And what that means is that they're paying over 50% of their income on rent. So you can imagine what's going to be left after they're doing that. Where do they go? Well, there's a lot of price fixing. There's concentrated ownership. It's not as if this is a competitive market. It is not a competitive market. The housing market does not operate along the lines of the fantasy that you learn in Economics 101. This is not a supply and demand problem. The extent to which supply and demand impacts this is that you have these corporate entities coming in and demanding and buying up all this property, and they're constricting the supply, which means there's less single-family homes available to first-time home buyers. And if you talk to real estate people, they will tell you that many of their clients lose out consistently. They're outbid by people paying cash, waiving inspections. These are the corporate landlords. They have the resources to do this. And that is what's happening in Jacksonville. In terms of the percentages, it's important to understand what the denominator is when we calculate these things. Is it the percent of all rental properties? That's one way to. Is it the percent of every single family home? Do we look at it in different communities? One of the things we noticed, and it depends on what kind of investors we're talking about, but the largest percentage of, let's just say, LLC-owned single-family homes is in the urban core. 32208, 32209, 32254, 32206.
And there's more to talk about there, especially when it comes to the policy of affordable housing. We're going to get to that in just a minute. We'll be right back.
From CBS 47 and Fox 30, you're watching This Week in the 904.
Welcome back to This Week in the 904. I'm your host, Emily Turner. We're talking about all things affordable housing today. One of the things, because we're talking about why this impacts the community, but who are the folks that are most impacted by this?
Well, as I said, the leading measure is the cost burden, the percentage of renters that pay 30% or more. And we decided we would do an analysis to see what is the breadth of this cost burden across the occupations in Jacksonville. So we took all the occupational categories. We took the median hourly wage, we converted that into an annual income, and then we simply calculated what percentage of occupations are cost burden based on the median hourly wage. 60% of the occupations in Jacksonville. So we're talking about a wide swath. When people talk about workforce housing versus affordable housing, it's all the same, okay? Working people across the occupational category are being impacted by this. Now, what would they need? The majority of these people are cost burden. What would the rent need to be in order for them, for a 2-bedroom apartment, in order for them not to be cost burden? It would have to be $1,000 or less. Someone does an analysis of the percentage of available units in the city based on different rent categories. That's 8%.
Only 8% are actually affordable to those folks.
That's right. Only 8% are available at the level that would ensure that they are not cost burdened.
And that's when people leave the city. They can't afford to live here.
Well, or they just pay what they have to pay and they try to get by. And often what you're talking about are people being displaced and obviously being evicted, and they're on the street. And the most recent census for the homeless is totally inaccurate because it does not capture the picture of those who have been displaced and obviously are not on the street because it's been criminalized.
Right. And people who have been displaced is something you guys studied, Katie, when it comes to evictions. I mean, what are we looking at here?
Yeah. So, overall, Jacksonville is the eviction capital of the state. We evict per capita nearly twice as many residents than any other big metropolitan area in Florida. So just off the bat, this is an extremely friendly city for eviction filings. And in addition to that, corporate landlords have far greater evictions, no matter if it's multifamily, single family. JWB alone evicted over 500 people of the properties that they owned in 2023.
Just in 1 year, they evicted 500 people?
In 1 year. And there's no really, ability to combat that when you're a tenant because these processes are nearly algorithmic in how the evictions are levied and how the process works through the court system. It's very difficult for tenants to actually fight these evictions. And it's a lot easier when you are a corporate landlord as you have a property manager who is specifically in the business of collecting rents. So part of that is being able to file evictions, repeatedly filing evictions, sometimes on the same tenant. And that makes it a lot easier for those corporate landlords to engage in aggressive eviction practices. It's a lot more difficult if you're a mom and pop landlord to go out, find a company to file this eviction for you or figuring out doing it yourself. It just tends to happen less.
Well, there's probably an element of compassion there because you're a tenant.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. When you have that human relationship of, this is the community that I live in as a landlord, this is a tenant that, maybe bagging my groceries at the store, maybe inserting an IV at an urgent care, there is definitely a level of compassion there.
When it comes to the fix for this, because it's clearly an issue that's weighing heavily on people, what are some of the policy changes that could help the situation?
Well, there would be two angles. One would be to expand the rights and protections for tenants. Florida has some of the weakest rights and protections of all the states in the country, right? So somebody did a ranking and we're like 44 out of 50. So because of that, some communities like Miami and Orlando and St. Pete and Tampa, they passed something called the Tenants' Bill of Rights to actually provide better rights and protections for the tenants who lived in their communities. We were trying to get one passed in Jacksonville, and the Florida State Legislature passed something called a preemption bill, which basically said no locality can pass any ordinance that regulates a relationship between tenants and landlords. All of the Tenants' Bill of Rights have been passed in other cities, were null and void, and we obviously stopped our effort to do it in Jacksonville because it was futile. Now, there are two provisions that still remain. One is creating an office of housing resources, a place where tenants would be able to get the information about properties about rights, about protections, about services, a place to file complaints for the conditions that they live under, and the other would be a landlord registry. Now, Councilman Peluso has just introduced a resolution to bring a landlord registry to Jacksonville. That is in the process. We would strongly support that. A landlord registry would require landlords and maybe landlords of a certain size. All of that has to be worked out. But the point is, there would be a registry publicly searchable, so everyone would be able to know exactly who owns the property they live in, who owns the multifamily apartment complex they live in. The city doesn't even know who owns these properties because, as Katie mentioned, they use these deceptive LLCs that have names with no relationship at all to the actual owner. So I'm hoping that maybe the city will think about the value of having a landlord registry. That would be a first step. The other is to try to regulate even further the corporate landlords. And lots of communities have proposed various ways of doing that, limiting the number of homes that any single corporation could own, levying a high tax on the transaction between somebody selling a home to a large corporate investor. So there are all kinds of things that have been proposed, but very few have been able to pass because remember, these corporate entities have enormous resources, they give campaign contributions, and they are politically powerful.
Well, and that was going to be my question for you, is when Mayor Deegan ran, affordable housing and workforce support, all of that was a big part of her platform. Do you feel like what has happened so far from the administrative side has there been any movement there? Because I know you've been a part of these conversations, at least to some extent, with the city.
Yeah. They have put in place the standard kind of affordable housing policies that we've been using for a long time that I don't think ultimately get to the source of the problem. And that is what I call supply side. How can we incentivize private for-profit developers and builders to leave some, percentage of the units that they're building to relatively lower income residents? And to do that, they don't want to do that. They want to make a profit. So you have to entice them. You have to give them a tax break. You have to use vouchers. You have to subsidize them. So, basically the way the system works, as long as you have housing that is privately owned and for profit, and the only reason they're interested in building housing is to make profit, then you have to create all of these techniques to try to incentivize them to do what we would call the right thing, or at least to provide some level of housing. It might make a lot more sense, and other communities have done this, is to pursue a social housing policy. This is publicly owned, nonprofit, mixed income housing being developed by public entities. Montgomery County, Maryland is probably the best example of that. They've been extremely successful. So the policies that they're putting in place, I applaud them. I'm glad they're paying attention to affordable housing, but these supply side policies are not going to solve the ultimate problem.
And so there's still more work to be done.
Much work.
When it comes to you said the landlord registry, but with some of the other items that you're talking about, has there been any movement, or do people just not seem interested in taking this on? Because it is a big battle to fight with people who are, contributing to campaigns.
Right. So at some point, like after a year of doing the Jack's Rental Housing Project, I realized, look, tenants cannot rely on a city council. They certainly can't rely on the Florida State Legislature. They're not interested in representing their interest in putting in policies that's going to make a difference. So I founded with several other people what's called a Jack's Tenants Union. And a tenants union, they're pretty widespread. They're popping up everywhere because people realize that tenants have to organize themselves politically. And what that means is collective action, not individual action. What that might mean in an apartment complex is if somebody is having serious problems with, let's say, mold, with pests, with backed up plumbing, with leaking, with just the conditions, the safety conditions that people live under, right? What do? Well, they could complain as an individual. They could go to the property manager, and the property manager would consider them to be a nuisance, and they'd probably be harassed, and they'd probably have an eviction filing or you talk to 10, 15, 20 other people who live in that building, and you put together a set of demands, collective action. So just as labor unions utilize collective action as the source of power, tenants are going to have to do the same thing. I do think that's an absolutely necessary ingredient. They have to take matters into their own hands.
Well, I thank you guys both for your time. It's such an interesting topic. There's so much more we could go on about, but unfortunately we're limited on time. So thank you guys for joining us today on This Week in the 904. We will see you next week for another episode.
Thanks for watching This Week in the 904.